My name is Paul Popiel, and I'm the Director of Bands at the University of Kansas. We're here today to talk with a very special guest, Robert E. Foster, the Director of Bands Emeritus at the University of Kansas, where he worked from 1971 to 2015. Mr. Foster is one of the world's leading band directors and has served as president of the American Band Masters Association, the National Band Association, the Big 12 Band Directors Association, and the John Philip Sousa Foundation. We're here today to talk about Mr. Foster and his experiences with the Midwestern Music Camp and some of our great camp history and traditions. Afterwards, we'll share a performance of Mr. Foster leading the camp band from a past year in a performance of Granger's Irish Tune. So, Mr. Foster, let me turn things over to you. Good morning and welcome.
Well, good morning.
So, you came to the University of Kansas in 1971. Was that your first year of involvement with the camps?
That was my first year of involvement in this camp. I had been involved in music camps since I was in elementary school, literally. My father ran music camps in South Texas, and so I was involved in those. And at the University of Florida, where I was prior to coming here, I was the one in charge of running the music camp. And so the music camp was something that I thought was very special and was absolutely unique to this situation. And I thought it was very important. So I was really pleased and honored to have the opportunity to become involved in the second oldest and the second biggest music camp in the United States of America. So that's where I was when I got here. And the director of the camp at that time was Russell L. Wiley, who was the director of bands for many years. And he was a very visionary man in many, many respects. And about in the early 30s, 1930s, he was involved in several different kinds of band festival events that were very big and very successful. He had been, prior to coming here, the band director in Enid, Oklahoma, at the college there, and he started an event there called the Tri-State Band Festival, which grew into a huge music program in the spring every year, where bands came in from 4 or 5 different states, and conductors and clinicians came in from all over the world. So Mr. Wiley had some background in promotion and building events like this. And in 1936, he started the Midwestern Music Camp. So anyway, shall I just continue? Okay. Sorry.
That'd be great. You're on a roll.
You got something to cut out. So this program began in 1936. So by the time I got here in 1971, it was already very, very well established. And it was 35 years old at that point. So I was pleased to join it. It was a bigger, longer event in those days than it is today. The camp previously had been a 6-week music camp. For 6 weeks, high school students from all over America and other places came to Lawrence, Kansas, and spent their summer making music with outstanding performers from schools all over the country. The program, by the time I got here, was a 5-week program. So when I got here, it started as a 5-week program with an add-on junior high camp that added 10 days to the length. And the first summer I was here, there were 3 concert bands, 1 very select band, 2 large concert bands, large meaning 90 students apiece or so, at 2 orchestras, a top orchestra, which was just superb, and 2 large choirs. And so when they were providing conductors and clinicians, there was a great number of a great variety of conductors and clinicians in here every summer in those days, because they were here for five different ones. Where a different conductor was here every week for 5 weeks for each group. And so the pattern was that we'd start a concert with a Sunday night rehearsal and rehearse it all week, and then present it the next weekend, take half a day off, take the students to Worlds of Fun or someplace neat, depending on which weekend it was, and then Sunday night, start a new concert with new conductors. So that was the pattern, and we went through a great amount of literature. You can just imagine how much literature that ensemble went through. It was like 5 concerts in 5 weeks with 5 different guest conductors and a resident conductor of each of the groups. So for people like me who like bands and like music and like that whole experience, it was a great opportunity to grow and to have the opportunity to experience other ways to do things, how to start a rehearsal with a new group every week and things like that. So it was a very important part of my education, as well as an important part of the education of a whole lot of other people. And that you can just imagine how good those groups were 5 weeks later after rehearsing hours and hours a day, every day for 5 weeks. And the top band and the top orchestra were truly, truly outstanding. There was not an all-state band anywhere in any state that was as good as those groups were, because we had the best players from a lot of all states. And it was not unusual to have a principal trumpet player, for example, from who was the first chair in the Colorado All-State, sitting by one who was first chair trumpet in the Texas All-State, sitting by one who happened to be from California. And so this was truly an outstanding musical experience for everybody involved in it. Now, with that said, and the group's getting better every week, certain traditions evolved that became a regular pattern. And one of the traditions that was really fun was the Mr. Wiley, who was the founder of the music camp, was also a really good conductor. And one of his favorite pieces was Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. And it became a tradition that on the last concert for the top band, unless the orchestra was doing it that year, and sometimes they swap back and forth, but on the last concert, they'd perform 1812 Overture, which is one of the most challenging pieces of literature for bands and orchestras that most of these students have ever seen before. It's very advanced professional level literature, and in all those years, the many years that the orchestra was so wonderful, they never ever played an arrangement of a major work, not once. They would always, if they're going to play Beethoven, they played Beethoven. If they were going to play Mozart, they played Mozart. So one reason students came here is they could have a musical experience at a level they could never possibly have at home. And so it was a very rewarding experience, a very important learning experience. And like I said, outstanding students from all over the country were a part of all of those camps in those days. Another tradition Mr. Wiley established early on was bringing in great guest conductors. He really wanted to build the camp and the camp's reputation for quality with the very best conductors that were available. And the music camp conductors, as a result of that, included the most famous and most prominent band and musical conducting personalities, not only in America in some cases, but in the world. And for example, I was thinking about this morning. The conductors on different years, but at one point, the conductor of every military band in Washington was a conductor in music camp. The Marine band, the conductor was here, the Army band, the Navy band, the Air Force band, and the Coast Guard conductor. And all of them were great. They're great conductors. Some of them were just magnificent conductors. And some of them were so good that they came back a number of times. One of the major stars earlier in camp was the best band in Washington in those days was the Navy band under the direction of Commander Brindler. Brindler was here for a number of years to the point where he was a regular conductor of one of the bands, and he had a great reputation, was a great musician, and it was an honor to play under people like that. Another one of the great conductors from the military bands was Colonel Arnold Gabriel. Colonel Arnold Gabriel was here 20 some odd consecutive years conducting. At that point, the Air Force band was the best band in the world, I believe, in my opinion. Another great conductor who was here was the only person in the history of the British Empire to be knighted for services to band music, and that was Sir Vivian Dunn, who was the conductor and commander of the Royal Navy in England, and he'd been knighted by Her Majesty the Queen, and these teachers would share these kinds of experiences, and so the kids had a rich cultural experience as well as a rich musical experience. Orchestra had the same kind of people. The conductors of major orchestras, well-known people. Victor Alessandro was conductor of the San Antonio Symphony, and he did a great job. And he was here for the last concert, the fifth concert, when it became a 4-year camp, the fourth concert on a regular basis. He was here 10 consecutive years, which is a commitment both ways. That means the conductors made a commitment to be here also. Another major star that conducted here when he was an up and coming rising star was, oops, I lost it. Andre Previn, who was a huge international star later. He wasn't a huge star when he was here, but he became a huge star. The director of the Tonight Show band and orchestra at NBC was a guy named Skitch Henderson, and he spent a week here. So this was a place where some of the most famous composers, conductors, musicians in the world would be here to share their experiences with young people. There was a composer named Roy Harris who wrote a piece that was very popular for a while called Cimarron. And Cimarron became the standard piece of band literature. And Roy Harris was here as a conductor in music camp. And of course, one of the things he conducted was Cimarron. And there was a place in the score that called for, it's probably in the percussion part, but called for a pistol shot, gunshot. And so they wanted it to be authentic. So Mr. Wiley had somebody go over to the track office and get a starting pistol, so it would sound like a real pistol, which of course it was. And then Mr. Harris insisted on conducting the piece and firing the gun himself. So in one of the rehearsals, where concerts were all in Old Hoke Auditorium, and one of the rehearsals, Roy Harris picked up his conductor with one hand, picked up the other again, shot it in the air like this. And one of the kids working in music camp, who was a joker, had bought one of these rubber chickens. It was up in the fly above the stage. and dropped it. And after he fired, it went plop right down beside the conductor. Anyway, there were a lot of fun experiences. Great stories were with 1812 Overture, with one of the most important parts of 1812 Overture, the cannon shots towards the end of 1812. And Mr. Wiley always conducted 1812 himself with the band, and he always wanted a bigger boom, bigger cannons. He wanted to win that war, I guess. And so the challenge was on for the librarians working with the bands, how to come up with a bigger boom. And one of the things that is frequently done there, and they did pretty frequently, where you get a big 55-gallon barrel and put it backstage and fire a shotgun in it loaded with blanks. And so that was pretty standard stuff. And they'd get Lawrence Police Department to come and manage that, and which they were always willing to do and very nice about it. Well, one year they had some rookie police back there, and the librarians had not gotten the barrel. So this was an old Hoke auditorium, which was a 4,000 seat auditorium, huge auditorium. And so came time to fire, and they cued the policemen, and they lifted up their rifles with blanks in it and shot up in the air into the curtains and blew holes in the curtain, which remained there as long as the building was up high. But they actually blew holes in the curtain. So one of the librarians, a later year, they had some bad experiences doing things like that. So he told Mr. Wiley, you get a bigger boom if you have a bigger barrel. Well, they don't know where you get a barrel bigger than 55 gallons. So he was raised in western Oklahoma on a ranch, and he said, I know how to get it. I'll go to the farm supply store and get one of these big galvanized water tanks. And he did that. It went to the farm supply store and told them what was going on, and they were good natured. He wanted to borrow the tank, put it backstage in Hoke Auditorium. And so it's backstage, and they've got the policemen to blow the shotguns into it. They blew holes in the bottom of the water tank. So music camp had to buy a water tank.
With holes in it.
Yeah, right. Another famous composer that was here was Robert Jager, who wrote a piece that everybody who knows band literature knows as Third Suite. And he was a popular conductor and guest conductor and composer. Another one was a former librarian in music camp who became a great composer and guest conductor named Claude Smith. And Claude Smith had, as a student assistant when he was at KU as a student, had been a librarian in music camp. Well, he ended up coming back later as an adult as one of the really foremost band conductors and band composers in America. And he was a very prominent guest who was here frequently. Probably the most popular and most favorite, if that's not good English, but the really most favorite of all the guest conductors was an Australian named Percy Granger. And Percy Granger, who was a world-class concert pianist, was also one of the most innovative writers of wind band music that's ever lived. And he wrote a number of pieces which are just among the most important cornerstones of wind band literature. And he and Mr. Wiley really got along well, and they were really good friends. And so one year he told Mr. Wiley, when I come back next year, I'm going to bring you a piece. And the piece, he showed up the next year, and the piece that he brought was a piece called Irish Tune from County Derry. And the first person who ever conducted that in our music camp was Percy Granger. And everybody liked it. Mr. Wiley liked it. And so they did it again the next year. And they continued to do it. uh, every year after that. And it became so popular that you remember this was a 5-week camp back in those days, if not 6, but it was for sure 5. And with as many ensembles as they'd have, as many weekly concerts, a different ensemble would perform it every week. And so the top band would always do it the first week because it's challenging musically. And that's where it would begin. And then the second band would do it the next week. And then the orchestra would do it the third week, and so on. And then on the final concert, all the kids really had this to look forward to. The top band would play it one more time, usually towards the very, very end, sometimes as an encore for 1812. But they'd always get to play 1812. They'd always get to play Irish tune. So that became just a great tradition, which has been going on for a really, really long time. I could go on and talk about the conductors for a long, long time, because every major conductor in America, practically, was a band conductor, was involved in music camp. Every major big star college conductor was here one time or another. And we're talking about for a lot of years. And a lot of them were here repeatedly. One of the great college band programs in America, it was the University of Illinois band. And the University of Illinois had one of the great band traditions in America. And they had a great conductor named Mark Hinesley, who was also he transcribed great orchestra pieces into major band pieces, and he was a conductor in camp, and Mr. Wiley had been wanting him to do a band transcription of Night on Bald Mountain, the great orchestra piece, and he brought that to music camp with him the last time that he came. So in the KU Band Library, there's a Mark Hinesley arrangement or setting of Night on Bald Mountain, and it was dedicated to Mr. Wiley, and first performed here ever when Mr. Hinesley was here to do it. So there's so many great memories and great traditions and great legacies, people that I have met through the years that would say, "Oh, I went to music camp at the University of Kansas." I mentioned Colonel Gabriel earlier, who was a fabulous conductor, and he was a guest conductor for the St. Louis Symphony, and for a big patriotic concert several years ago. And so he was over and in the dress rehearsal. They came to a break, and at the break in the orchestra rehearsal, 2 violinists, 2 young ladies, came up to see him and wanted to talk to him. And he said yes. And then they said, "We played under you in Lawrence in the music camp, and here they are playing professionally for a living in the St. Louis Symphony." They were members of the Marine Band. I can name a whole bunch of them who all went to music camp. Same way in the Army Band, same way in the Air Force Band. But it has been a training ground for outstanding young musicians who went on to have outstanding careers, both as performers and teachers and composers for decades. I mean, lots of decades. And so it's really, it's a very special tradition, and it's a real honor for me to be a small part of it.
Well, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, speaking of traditions, by my count, this 2020 virtual music camp will be your 50th.
Well, that's right. The first one was 71, and so that's what it adds up to.
Well, we're sorry you're not going to be live with us. Of course, we're all online for the 50th anniversary. We'll have to throw you a bigger party for 51 next year. So for a number of years now, certainly as long as I can remember and back some, you have taken the baton and kept the tradition of Irish tune alive. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experiences with Irish tune, and there's a special added part only for camp. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that came to be?
Certainly. Well, I was pretty familiar with Irish tune before I ever came to Lawrence, and I knew it. I conducted it, and I liked it. And the first person I ever heard conducted in Lawrence was Mr. Wiley, and and in the first rehearsal that I heard from him, I heard this for the first time, and I've heard it every time it's been performed in music camp since then. But he was conducting it right along, and it was gorgeous. He always managed to get an absolutely wonderful, rich, warm, balanced, in tune sound out of that piece that some people don't bother to do. But he did, and it always sounded better than when most other people do it. And then in the most dramatic part of the whole piece, he cues the timpani, and the timpani come in for a big roll, and it leads you into the next section. And he did this. It sounded great. It added to the excitement, and everybody liked it. And but it wasn't the way I'd ever heard it done before. So I hadn't been here too long, a couple of years, maybe several years. And Mr. Wiley was still in his office in music camp. And one day I went in and asked him, I said, Mr. Wiley, why do we add the timpani roll in Irish tune? Because it's not published. It's not in any of the publications. And he said, oh, that's the way Mr. Granger did it. And I thought, oh, okay. Well, that should be good enough for me then. And it's been good enough for me ever since.
That's a pretty good reason to use the timpani part.
Not bad. And besides, it makes the piece a lot more fun at the end.
So even in retirement, you have graciously agreed to come back every summer and work with the camp bands and, as we just mentioned, conduct Irish tune. What drives you to keep with the camp and continue to meet the young people that come and pass along the traditions and the camp experiences that you've been a part of for so long? What drives you to continue to work with us?
What else would I do? That's part of who I am. It's part of what I am. And it never occurred to me to not do it. That's what you do in the summer. You go to music camp. And this year is no exception.
Well, we're glad of that, and we're glad to have you with us this year too.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Foster, thanks for talking with us today. We're going to follow this interview with a performance captured one of our past years. We're going to show a video to the campers this year so that they're at least part of the Irish tune tradition in this virtual Midwestern Music Camp.